and welcome everybody. We're just waiting for everybody to get connected into the actual out of the waiting room. So appreciate your patience and lovely to see everybody joining this nice summer's evening, which is a change for normal. Well, I hope it is where you are. Where I am, sun is shining. It may not be everywhere, but at the moment we have a bit of a brightness, which is lovely to see. So I'm just connected in there, the last few members, and we'll get started then. We're looking forward to a wonderful evening and presentation from our esteemed speaker. I'm delighted to have Lee joining us this evening. So when I see everybody's got connected, and then we'll fire on and introduce and welcome everybody. Okay, so my screen has stopped connecting, so I'm going to start. So good evening and welcome. Thanks to everybody for joining the call. My name is Sinead Dillon. I'm the BCS NI Chair. I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of the committee to this event this evening. And we're delighted to be joined by Lee Gowdy, who is the head of UX and design at the Department of Finance. And Lee is going to talk to us this evening about accessibility. And we're delighted that Lee is joining us because we understand this is such a very topical area, and it's a minefield of trying to find information out about it and understanding, and it is such essential to have any of our communications totally matching the requirements for accessibility. There's so many areas that you can get information for, but Lee is going to help navigate through his experience and show us and talk about the regulations that are needed, and also to give us some of his lessons learned and experience. So it's really useful to have the insights for that we can all take away into our day-to-day activity. So as you know, we're going to be recording this event, and so it will be available for replay at a later date, and we will be putting it up onto the BCS NI website. As soon as that's available, we will share out the link with the members. We'll also send out the slides after the event. So Lee is going to go through his presentation, and we'll make them available to you after the session, probably in the next few days. Although this is a mute call, we have everybody's mics muted, we would like and ask for your participation. And we know there'll be some questions that you might want to ask. So please use the chat facility, and please I
think we might have lost Sinead for a bit.
Hello.
I can hear you now.
Okay, I beg your pardon. Sorry.
It's all right.
It's the joys and the challenges of our website, or sorry, our internet connections. So I was just saying, please, if you have any questions, add them into the chat. We'll review them at the end of today's presentation. We will go through the questions. There may be questions that we don't get through, but what we will do is we will review the questions and we'll filter out and maybe organize another subsequent event to address any of those accessibility questions and issues that may arise. So please, again, going through the sessions, if there's anything you want to ask, please drop it into the chat and we'll cover off then. So that's enough from me. You didn't come to hear me. I'm going to pass you over now to Lee Gowdy, and thank you, Lee, for agreeing to this presentation, and we look forward to hearing all your insights. Thank you.
Not a problem. Well, I share my slides here. Just checking everybody see those. Yeah. Sinead,
Yep. Yep, got them. Yep.
So good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us for this overview of accessibility. Just to give you a bit of a background on myself. So I'm Lee Gowdy. I'm from the Enterprise Digital Development branch that sits within the Department of Finance. And within that, I head up the UX and design teams. The Enterprise Digital Development basically are a development unit that make web apps, but also make quite a lot of the central NICS websites. And I was tasked with ensuring the central NICS websites were accessibility audited and had an accessibility statement in place for the September 2020 public sector bodies accessibility regulations deadline. So although I had some prior knowledge of previous accessibility guidelines, there was a lot that I had to get my head around in order to take that task forward. So I learned a lot from gov.uk, other accessibility leads across government, as well as accessibility personnel within the private sector, and webinars and blogs. So this overview is basically what I learned in order to pass on some of that information to the rest of you. So what I will be covering is what is accessibility in the broader sense. The moral argument for accessibility, we all got caught up on regulations and legislation, but there's a moral reason we should be doing this. The regulations that actually cover web accessibility, we'll dig a bit into web accessibility itself, and then some lessons learned that I have picked up through my journey. So firstly, what is accessibility? And there's a lot of definitions that I came across, but one that stuck with me was from the gov.uk accessibility blog. So accessibility means that people can do what they need to do in a similar amount of time and effort as somebody that does not have an impairment or disability. It means that people are empowered, can be independent, and will not be frustrated by something that is poorly designed or implemented. But what I've realized is that accessibility is not something that's black and white. It's not true or false. It can be only viewed in relation to a specific ability or scenario. So something can be accessible to some people while being inaccessible to others. So to illustrate that, when we're talking about accessibility of a building, it is usually taken to mean that somebody in a wheelchair can get into and use that building. And it conjures up images of accessibility ramps, automated doors, push button doors. But that demonstrates an understanding of accessibility that is too narrow, as far as I'm concerned. So what about somebody who is visually impaired? We could be introducing braille signage and tactile signage to help them navigate once they're inside the building. If we look at what about somebody who has hearing difficulties, if a fire alarm went off, how would they be alerted to that fact? So we then put in emergency lighting to help them out. And ultimately, by implementing all of these improvements, the building works better for everyone. So what it really boils down to, accessibility is making sure that things work for everybody, regardless of what impairments they have or which tools they may use. And what we should be aiming for and what the goal should be is accessible to all is the goal. We want to make everything accessible to all and level that playing field. So moving on to then, what is the moral argument for doing accessibility? So many people don't have a disability or impairment yet. So according to the National Statistics Family Resources Survey, the prevalence of disability rises with age. So in the UK, 8% of children are registered as disabled, and that number goes up to 19% of working age adults. And then frighteningly, that over doubles to 46% of people over state pension age. And if we look at that in the round as a total figure, that's 22% of all people, roughly 1 in 5 people in the UK. That's a significant portion of our populace. We also know that many more have a temporary disability or a situational accessibility need. So what do I mean by that? If we take our sense of touch, a permanent disability is somebody who has been born without a limb or through an accident has lost one. But a temporary disability or accessibility need is if you're walking down the pavement and you trip and you break your arm, for 6 to 8 weeks, you now have a limb that's out of action. And that can happen to any one of us. Also situational, if you think of somebody who's a new parent, they now have a dependent that is dependent on them all the time, and they're either having to lift or hold them. And that again means that they're not able to do everything that you used to be able to do in the way that they were previously doing it. So you can find yourself in this situation very quickly. Also, from an Office of National Statistics Internet user survey, we know that roughly 10 million people in the UK who have a disability also use the internet. So again, these are large numbers of our populace. And me, from a public sector point of view, people may not have a choice when using a public sector website or mobile app. So it's important that they work for everybody. If you want to drive, you need a license, and more of these services are being pushed online. So those services online must work for everybody. And we think of some of the services that the government provide. So if we're thinking about universal credit or rate rebate or the blue badge scheme, the people who actually need them the most are often the people who find them the hardest to use, the most vulnerable people in our society. So again, it's explicitly important that those services work for everybody. And going back to the analogy of the building, accessible websites usually work better for everyone. So implementing these will actually help the rest of your users out. And even if you take it from a business point of view or an organization's point of view, accessible websites are often faster, easier to use, and actually appear higher in search engine rankings. So it works for everybody. But again, I can't stress enough, it is usually the most vulnerable people in our society that services are directed at, so they must work for them. So that's a bit around the moral argument for this. But of course, there are the regulations that govern this. And yes, we have the most recent edition of the public sector bodies accessibility regulations. But accessibility in Northern Ireland is covered by more than that. There's several pieces of legislation that actually cover this. We firstly have the Disability Discrimination Act of 1995 in Northern Ireland. We also have Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act in 1998. And yes, the most recent, the Public Sector Bodies Accessibility Regulations of 2018. So I just want to touch on why each of these affect accessibility. So the Disability Discrimination Act of 1995 in Northern Ireland. So the types of discrimination that can help you challenge are direct discrimination, such as a ban on employing blind people. Disability-related discrimination, for example, a taxi driver refusing to take a blind passenger because they have a guide dog. Specific around accessibility of service, failure by an organisation to make a reasonable adjustment to allow you access to goods, facilities, or services. And that is more important now that we're putting these things online, and victimisation and harassment. Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act in 1998. So it requires public authorities to have due regard for the need to promote equality of opportunity between persons of different religious belief, political opinion, racial group, age, marital status, or sexual orientation, men and women in general, and specifically with accessibility in mind, persons with a disability and persons without, and then persons with dependents and persons without. So those two pieces of legislation are already embedded. And it's the new public sector bodies accessibility regulations. And now I say new, it did come in 2018. But it's there to ensure public sector bodies, websites and mobile apps can be used by as many as people as possible. What that ultimately means when you boil it down, your websites and apps have to meet the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.1 to the standard of AA compliance. It also means that you have to publish a compliant accessibility statement. Now, a compliant public accessibility statement, there's a sample for this on gov.uk, and I would advise you to go and look at it, because gov.uk are the monitoring body, so the people who will actually see and if you're compliant, if you're using their template, you can't go wrong. But ultimately what that accessibility statement does is call out how accessible your website is, the enforcement procedure, who to complain to if you have an issue, what part of the application or website isn't compliant, and how and when you're going to actually deal with that to make it compliant. Now, I say this came in 2018. There was 2 deadlines for it. Now, they both have passed. By September 2019, you had to get anything that was going out the door accessible. And September 2020 last year was to get your legacy things up to accessibility standards. And that was the deadline I was aiming for when I was auditing the websites. Now, you still have time, not a lot. The date for getting your mobile apps compliant is the 23rd of June this year. So not a lot of time. So panic if you haven't done anything about this. But what I would say is, and I want to stress this, is if you are a public sector body, there is no opting out of this. There simply isn't. It's baked into law. It started in EU law, but it has been written into UK law, and it is not a devolved matter. So if you're a public sector body in the UK, there's no opting out. And you will be breaking the law if your website or app is not accessible. Now, the gov.uk monitoring team is actively auditing sites at the minute to check for compliance. Emails have been hitting inboxes. What they're doing is sending, they have audited several websites. They draw together a report, email the owner of that website, and give you 12 weeks to get your house in order before they revisit it. So they are actively pursuing this now. And enforcement by the Equality Commission in Northern Ireland is where you may end up. So that hasn't happened as yet, but the speed that they're starting to roll out the monitoring, I can see that being a thing quite soon. So burying your head in the sand is not the way to go about this at the minute. Now, the only way you can legally be non-compliant is to argue disproportionate burden. Now, I think it's going to be hard to do this, and from what I've seen, some of the disproportionate burden claims have been challenged and they're seen as not disproportionate burden. But for example purposes, you may be able to argue disproportionate burden if the cost of making a service accessible will consume the majority of the department or organization's budget for the year. Now, when we're talking about the public sector and some of the department budgets, I think that would be a hard argument to make. One thing they do caveat that with is you cannot use lack of time or knowledge as a reason. You also can't argue it is disproportionate because you have not given it a priority. And given that this has been in place since September 2018, that time has moved on. So, and one thing I would add in, even if you argue disproportionate burden, you still have to comply with the Disability Discrimination Act and Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act. So it's not your get out of jail free card. If you can argue disproportionate burden, you're still covered by those other pieces of legislation. Now, if I dig a bit more into web accessibility, and one thing whenever I started going through this was, what do these regulations actually cover? So they mention mobile apps and websites. Now, they are specific in mobile apps that they are native mobile apps built purposely for mobile phones, whether that's on iOS or Android. Websites is a bit more of a gray area because they say websites, but they don't define what that means. So I had to do a bit of digging around other accessibility leads across the UK government, into the European Commission website and see what they're saying as they define it. And thankfully, the non-profit JISC, who give advice and guidance to the UK public sector, had drawn some of that together as well. So on their website, what they state is a website is a collection of related web pages sharing common characteristics, theme navigation, and visual aspects, identified internally and or externally by a site name, managed and communicated as a single entity, or hosted on a specific instance of a web server. Further to that, they go, we believe that a web application running in a website browser is also covered by the accessibility regulations because it can be classified as a dynamic website with user interactions and input responsible for running the page. So basically, if it runs in a browser, it's a website, and it's internal or external. The legislation mentions intranets and extranets. So this covers everything. So if it's internally facing, it is still covered by this legislation. And not to hammer home a point, but if you're a public sector body, you will be breaking the law if your website or app is not accessible. So now we know what it covers. What do we ultimately have to look at in these? So for something to be accessible, something needs to be able to complete a task that they're trying to achieve without encountering a barrier or issue. So in terms of websites, to complete a task on a website, there are a number of things that need to work that the Web Consortium Accessibility Guidelines has categorized as it needs to be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So let's dig a bit into those sort of to see what the definition of that actually means. So for perceivable, it needs to be available to one of the user's senses. So for example, if the information is provided as text and someone who has sight, they need to be able to see it. If someone has sight issues, the text needs to be available in a format that means a screen reader can convert it to audio, or an electronic braille device can convert it to touch. So it needs to be perceivable to one of their senses. So operable. So that basically means if someone is using a keyboard, they should be able to do everything that someone using a mouse can do. And that includes navigating your website, using forms to provide information, and use controls such as buttons. So there's different keystrokes that can to activate a button or activate a link. So you have to be coded in such a way that it's flagging it up. And if you're specifically if you're using a keyboard, your tab order then becomes very important so that they know that they're going through the website in a logical order. And keyboard focus. So whenever you tab to a control or a link or a button, you have to visually be able to see how that is represented on the screen so that the user doesn't get lost. And in a lot of the audits that we did last year, that came up time and time again. The keyboard focus just was not accessible. You couldn't see where the person was on the website. Understandable. So this seems like a no-brainer. The information makes sense to the user. So for people that struggle to process text, which may be the case for somebody who has dyslexia or on the autistic spectrum, the information should be in plain English and aid comprehension. Now, I know from working in government can be bad at this. Internally, we speak in acronyms, we speak in our own internal business language, and that's true of other organizations. But we then put that out into content and expect the public to be able to decipher that. We need to get better and start putting stuff in plainer English and actually try to aid comprehension. And finally, robust. So that means that the web page works as expected in the technology that someone is using, such as a screen reader. So these assistive technologies should be able to use your website straight away. And that requires you to code it properly. A screen reader will pick up what is a link or a button only if it is marked up as such. It will pick up alt attributes on images, but only if they're there to be picked up. So it must be robust enough so that these assistive technologies can use them. Now, I came across a great resource on the UK Home Office. What they did was they broke down disabilities or impairments into these categories, and they pulled together posters of do's and don'ts whenever you're thinking about building a website or a web app. Now, I'm going to go through an example of each to give you a flavor of that, but I would advise you to go and source. These are on the Home Office GitHub, and there's loads of different examples within the posters. So I'm just giving you a flavor here, but I would advise you to go and see them. And if you are running a development team, and if we ever get back into offices, I would advise you to stick them up around the walls as a reminder to people to keep these things in mind. So if we go first to the autistic spectrum, they're saying to do use simple colors and don't use bright contrasting colors. You know that people on the autistic spectrum can have sensory overload, whether that be sound or vision. So use simple colors. Users of screen readers. So describe images and provide transcripts from video. I'd mentioned the alt attribute of an image. So if that isn't there, a screen reader will just flag up that an image exists, but not tell you anything about it. And if you're trying to convey information with that image, it will then be lost to that user. And don't only show information in an image or video. Complement it with text or a transcript or closed caption. Low vision. Again, this seems like the obvious thing. Use good color contrast and readable font size, and don't use low color contrast and a small font size. Every single audit we did last year, and that was over 30 audits, and by the end of it, all of them had color contrast issues. So something that we thought, no brainer, it was in every single audit that we did. Dyslexia. So use images and diagrams to support your text, and don't use large blocks of heavy text. Now, a colleague who was dyslexic explained to me that sort of text on the screen becomes a bit jumbled up, and therefore it's harder. So if you imagine with large blocks of text, that just makes it even more harder. And a picture paints 1,000 words. So if you complement your text with images and diagrams, that will help. Deaf or hard of hearing. So do write in plain language and don't use complicated words or figures of speech. Now, this cuts across many different things, but it also comes into the fact of making it accessible for those people who came here from other countries and refugees who are availing of public sector services, and English may not be their first language. So it cuts across many different things. Those with physical or motor disabilities, do make large clickable actions and don't demand precision. If you think of somebody who may have Parkinson's or mobility issues, who may have a tremor, it just becomes infinitely harder when you're demanding precision of your controls. It also, if you reflow your website into a mobile, it makes it easier because people are using their thumbs and that. So large clickable actions. But as I say, go and find these posters. Like they were a real eye opener for me for giving them the examples in those different scenarios. But it's not always these things. I've mentioned content before. So content, whenever somebody comes with something important and they have a piece of content and you know straight away that it's not accessible. So something that is recent enough to us all, we have the coronavirus restrictions. And this came out last June, and we were being asked to put it on a website as an image. Now, well, I do have an impairment. I need glasses to see, but even with them on, the amount of information here is information overload. And due to the amount of information, the font size is really reduced, and it's really hard to read and decipher what is going on. Now, they have done some positive things in terms of color coding and putting ticks in various places. But even if you put that up as an image, there's no way you're going to write alt text to describe what's going on in there. So somebody who is using a screen reader is completely at a loss from the start. But if you also put a filter on it for somebody who may have green color blindness, you find that two of those categories suddenly blend into one. And now it's even more harder to discern. And those things that have ticks against them are now all the same color. Now, ultimately, this didn't end up as content on a website. Neil, one of our web developers, came up with a brilliant solution in HTML with accessibility in mind, and that's what we went forward with. But definitely content needs to be made more accessible. I was thinking of talking about PDFs, but I've seen hour-long presentations about PDF accessibility. What it really comes down to, PDFs, although they can be made accessible, it's really laborious and long to try and make them accessible, especially if they are huge reports. The best thing to do is try and get most of that information on as HTML rather than PDFs. Now, there are tools that you can use to help whenever you're doing accessibility checks. Now, I have an asterisk against help, and I'll come on to that in a bit. But here are some of the tools that I have found useful in trying to identify accessibility issues on websites. Firstly, Axe. It's a Chrome browser plugin, and it's the tool that the Cabinet Office monitoring team use. So it's a good thing to use to get you off on a good footing. It is more put towards developers, so it embeds itself within the Chrome developer tools and opens up in that console. And it looks more like a debugging tool, and it'll flag up in the code where the accessibility issue is, what guideline that it's breaching, and an explanation of how to fix it. A similar tool, which is Wave, again, is a browser plugin, but the interface is sort of slightly more friendly to those who are more of a development mindset. It'll bring up a sidebar listing out all your issues, but it will also put a helpful wee icon directly on the web page where the issue resides. Again, it will explain why it's a breach of the guideline, what guideline it's breaching, and how you can fix it. Silktide, so Silktide are an accessibility organization, and they produced a browser plugin, which is an accessibility simulator. So what it actually does is manipulate your web page and show you what somebody with dyslexia sees whenever they view it, somebody with various different color blindnesses, somebody with cataracts, tunnel vision, peripheral vision, and it also has a screen reader. And what I find it really good at doing is building empathy with your users when you can actually visually see what your website looks to various people who have various eyesight issues. Finally, screen readers. So the main one I've used is NVDA because it's Windows and I work mainly on a Windows machine. But there's VoiceOver for Mac and Google TalkBack for Android. Now, what I would say is, for somebody who doesn't use these, it's actually quite difficult. And you mainly have to use a keyboard to navigate your website. So it's actually good from that point of view, because then you, again, it builds empathy when you're trying to use your website using a keyboard and get frustrated whenever you can't. Otherwise, if you try and use a mouse, you hover over anything that's got text, it'll start reading it out and you get quickly frustrated with it. But it is good to build empathy and see what other people are struggling with. Now, the caveat to all of that is automated checks will not find every flaw. And in fact, a government digital services audit of automated tools found out that of 142 known accessibility issues that they tested, the PEST tools only found around 30 to 40% of those issues. So your automated checks will only get you so far. If we look at alt text, so the alt attribute of an image, if it's empty, it will flag it up as an accessibility issue. But if it's a decorative image, it's not required to have alt text, so you get a false positive. Also, it will not tell you how good that alt text is. So if it's a picture of a dog and the alt text says this is a cat, it'll not flag it up as an issue, but it is an issue. So you need to complement automated tools with manual testing. You can't just point the tool at it and expect you to walk away once you've cleared all those issues. So you need to do some level of manual testing. So if we go on to basically lessons learned, so things that sort of struck me as I was going through this, and one of the main things that came to me was there is no silver bullet. It takes a coordinated approach with everybody playing their part. And it's not just an IT problem. So I know there's people want a guru to walk in and solve all their accessibility issues. And yes, there is room for accessibility leads that will give you a consistent view of things so that your organization is all doing the one thing, and they can introduce policies so that everybody's doing the same thing and adhering to the same policies. But it needs a coordinated approach. And especially when you're building services or websites, you have all these different roles to play a part. Now, I've bolded the service and website owner because it is them that are ultimately responsibility for the accessibility of their service or website. So it starts there. They need to be requesting that whatever they're buying, whether it's building internally or through a contract, that it stipulates what they want is an accessible service or website. But if we even dig down into the delivery manager and product manager, they're there to make sure that the service and website owner gets what they want. So they need to be keeping an eye on, is it accessible? What are we building? Is it accessible? Your user researchers need to be feeding back to the team any sort of user insights that they're getting, and any specifically accessibility needs of the users that are going to be using your service. The business analyst needs to be building accessibility into their definitions of done, or creating accessible user stories to pass on to the team. The content designer, as I say, if we make an accessible platform, putting in accessible content on it undermines all that good work. Your interaction designer or UX designer needs to be making sure that their prototypes and mock-ups have accessibility thought into or put into them, so that the software engineer and front-end developer knows that that thing is, and they can code it in an accessible fashion. So you can take a design but code it in an inaccessible way. So software engineers and front-end developers need to get their head around this as well. And QA testers, as they're testing going along, need to not just be testing for functional bugs, but accessibility issues as well. So as they say, it takes a village. There's so many rules, but they all need to play a part in making accessible. So we need to be building with accessibility in mind. We need to be doing manual testing. And if possible, test with users who have accessibility needs. That'll be invaluable. Now, I know internally we're not there yet. We do usability testing. We struggle with recruitment for that, but it's something we're getting better at. But actually testing with users who have accessibility needs would be brilliant, and it's definitely a goal of mine for my team. I would say don't leave accessibility to the end. Like anything, fixing the accessibility issues after development will just cost you time and money. The same with like anything, if you have security of that, if you just build something and then fingers crossed at the end it'll pass all the tests, you're going to run into difficulties. So you really need to build it in from the start and throughout your process. And I have no doubt that this will require a culture change within organizations, even from awareness. So sessions like this, the amount of people I talked to whenever we were first going through the websites who had no idea that these regulations had come into force, let alone 2 years prior to me talking to them. They didn't actually understand what the accessibility end of things were, why it was important, what the end effects of that would be to users with accessibility needs. So it will require a culture change moving forward, but at least the conversation is starting. Another thing that I came across, which is humorous on one side, but I've basically witnessed every stage. So the 5 stages of accessibility, it was written by Derek Featherstone on his Simply Accessible blog. The first stage that everybody goes through is denial. So I've had this so many times. This is a web application, so those rules don't apply to us. As we know from the legislation, if it comes on if it works in a browser, then it's a website. Or people with disabilities don't come to my site. They just aren't my customers. And I've heard this. It surprised me the first time I heard it, because I asked the question, how did you know? And I was met with no response. But that's denial. Denial then suddenly turns to anger. And it is that I can't believe they're making us do this. Or why don't our team members know how to do it already? Or why am I having to deal with this now? And the bargaining stage. So this is the one I've found most people spending most time on. What about making it just A compliant rather than AA compliant? Or can we just leave that part for later? You get into bargaining about what can we get away with. And actually, if people spent more time fixing the issues rather than figuring out how much they could get away with, the conversation would probably be shorter and you'd have an accessible website or service quicker. Then the realization hits in with a dose of depression. So people sort of say, we've done all this work, it's made no difference, and that consultants told us we've still done it wrong. That's really hard, and there's so much to think about. And that's true. You know, I've gone through a year of trying to get my own head around it. And for developers and everybody else, there is a learning curve here, and it is going to take a while. But ultimately, we will get to the final stage of acceptance. So let's make things as accessible as we can in a way that doesn't compromise our business goals or the aesthetic quality of our website. And if we need to make changes later to make it more accessible, then we'll do that. So acceptance is where I want everybody to get to. Everybody who plays a part in this. Let's make these things accessible. We have a moral obligation, never mind the legal obligation. And I just want to round off with one last thing. So 22% of the UK population have brown eyes. So if I go back to the start of this talk, this is the same number of people classified as disabled in the UK. Now imagine telling somebody that they couldn't use your service because they had brown eyes. It'd be baffling to you. So why would we do it for people who are disabled? So thank you very much for listening. Hope you've got something out of it. And if we have any questions, I'll try and answer them if I can.
That's great, Lee. Thank you so much. That was amazing. And we do have a few questions, but I think it just may be worth taking a few minutes just to recap on what you've gone through there, and just the breadth of information that you shared with us has been great. You know, just to put it into simple and understandable language. We all know, and it's clouded and it's very hard. But when you put it down in terms of it's 1 in 5 people have a disability, when you talk about the 22% people and saying they could be excluded, that makes it very much brings it to the fore, and we can actually get a picture, an image of that. I think the great you've outlined the regulations and they're given. You know, there is no way of avoiding this, and there shouldn't be, because as you said, the moral argument is there that we need to do this. But when you talk about, you know, in terms of how the screen readers work, and when you talk about the whole Home Office and their posters and the guidelines, you know, the impact of people who have, you know, the dyslexic, who have the, you know, the low vision, you know, who are deaf and who, you know, have impacted by the actual websites not doing what they need to do, and this being the only way that people can get to do services, public sector services, and any services as well, makes it all the more compelling and makes it more real for us. Brilliant to have an idea of what tools to use, and also your lessons learned there have been very much something that I think we can all be guided by. For that one, and then the 5 stages of accessibility, it's hard to say, but I mean that's probably a really, like, I was kind of thinking like that it's a dabda, you know. It's just like, you know, when you put it into the thing, helping to avoid denial, angry, bargaining, depression, wasting all that time to do it, which really want to go for the acceptance, which is like, you know, when people are doing it, they're so skilled at doing what they're doing, adding in the accessibility round, you know, it's just that extra step there that, you know, we need to embrace that and bring that on. And I think you know, the more we can talk about that, the better, as you say. And so delighted, and thank you so much for going through that with us. And I know that everybody will be keen to get to read the slides again. So we do have a few questions. So first question here is there a tool or feature that is designed for accessibility that you use now frequently? So just kind of about the tools. I know you've mentioned some tools there. Is there anything you think that, you know, you've used?
Yeah, definitely. It's like the Axe and Wave tools I use constantly, because running them will give you an immediate hit of something that it'll give you a red flag that then you can go and dig into a bit further. So if you're just curious, if something comes across your desk and are worried about the accessibility, those tools will give you an automatic red flag because they will pick up the main big things. And you would have to dig in with manual testing, but Wave and Axe. Wave is slightly, as I say, more illustrative to people who aren't more tech savvy. Axe, it looks like a program debugger. So if you're trying to use it to illustrate to a content manager or somebody within the business, Wave would be a bit better to use than Axe. Axe is better for developers, I've found, but I use both of those constantly.
Excellent, brilliant. And I suppose there's one question here that is talking about making an accessible site that looks good rather than sometimes making them, like, sometimes they're more stark and utilitarian. I suppose is there thoughts? Do you have any thoughts about that in terms of how the sites can look?
Yeah, well, it's ultimately it's harder work to make, but it comes down to your designer. A good designer will be able to define a color palette that solves your contrast issues. You can have your images as long as they're bodied up with some text and have good alt text in it. So yes, you can do it. It's just harder work. But if you put the time in, and you have a good designer, a good web designer, who has their head screwed on with accessibility in mind, yeah, you can do it. But be under no illusion, it does take a bit more work.
It's also come down to the familiarity with it. And if you design early, if you think about, you know, if you design with an accessibility headset ahead, you know, then that means that there's less rework, and you are, you know, you're going to encompass those good practices, but a nice design as well, because you're getting that early. Okay, there's another thought came in here. A suggestion: is the only true solution to getting accessibility in vogue is to make the tools like JavaScript fail to compile or run the code if the code doesn't include the appropriate accessibility content? I know. I think that the other caveat to that is that this would be technically hard to do, but it's an idea.
Well, it is and it isn't. And so I'll start with the is. Yep. So you can build automated accessibility checks whenever code is being compiled. Or so our guys, you can use Axe Core into your automated testing. So when somebody compiles code or uploads it on the servers, it can do that as a final check, and we'll stop that happening and flag up, no, there's bugs in this, there's accessibility issues within it. The way I said no is because that will be doing an automated check, so you're missing out on the manual check, so you may be missing out and stuff. But if your developers are doing agile sprints and are checking code in and out all the time, definitely that is a brilliant way to sort of flag up things early. And then if you have QA testers in there sort of doing a few more manual checks around that. But for your coders to build in automated accessibility checks, which you can do with Axe Core, is certainly, it's definitely a part of the belt and braces approach.
Excellent, and it gets to start addressing that, and it makes improvements as well to do that. Good. A question there about the accessibility rules in the Republic of Ireland, but we really focuses on today on the UK and Northern Ireland.
Well, I can answer that because the current legislation actually started off in EU law, so it covered the entirety of the EU. It was written in the UK law because of Brexit. So the Republic of Ireland is still covered by the EU law that is in place today. So the same law applies. Now, the Disability Discrimination Act and Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act don't apply to the South, and I'm not aware of, but I'm sure there are other legislation there. But in terms of the public sector bodies, accessibility regulations, it'll be the same. I can't off the top of my head remember the EU version of it, but it's covered by the same legislation.
Excellent. That's good. Thank you very much. Other question here, just before, if there's any more questions, please get them in. Now we're coming to the last few questions here and or comments. Have you used Google Lighthouse for accessibility testing, Lee? Have you ever heard of that one?
Yeah, I've used Google Lighthouse to give an overall health of website or web app, and I do find it is good. It does. I do find sort of Wave and Axe a bit more thorough in telling you what's wrong, and a bit more usable for me. I think it does give you a good sort of the same thing Google does. It designs an interface well and shows you flags up with percentages and colors and everything. So it's a nice interface for that, and I have used it in the past. I do just prefer Axe and Wave because you can dig into a bit more in your accessibility statements where you aren't accessible. You have to say which guideline you're breaching, so that information is you really need that information, and some of those other tools give you that a bit more readily.
Okay, great. So one of the comment here, and really just is it's a call out to please make sure that there's a telephone number to access the company with a human being answering it. So that's another angle on this as well too. We totally appreciate that. So
yeah, that's accessibility in the broader sense. You know, I do know with COVID and that they have pushed a lot of desk services where you're actually face to face with a person more online. And I think the people do need to sort of take that in mind. Are they cutting off people with accessibility needs by doing that?
Yeah, okay. There's a note here to say that there's an Axe accessibility inter-extension available on VS Code. So just to share that with everybody that I don't really follow that totally, but I'm sure that any of the actual people will make that be useful for them to have the extensions that they can plug in. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, great. That's useful. The other thing is we will be sharing the presentation with people who've attended this. There'll also be a copy of the video recording will be available if anybody want to watch back and share with others, because that is the key thing. While we've had the opportunity to listen to the evening, we'd like you to make sure and share that to other people as well too, because it's about getting this message out. BCS is really making sure that IT good for society, and this is a core theme for us, and we're delighted to be able to have Lee to make this presentation, but we also ask you to maybe share that along as well too. There also has been shared there in the chat there, the link to the posters. On GitHub. So I would suggest everybody takes that down, and I will try and get that added into the
I have the link in my slides as well.
Right, so the link's in the slide there. So great. Okay, and the other comments that have come through is to thank you, Lee, for your presentation. Been very useful, very informative. You've covered a huge amount of stuff, and really a good lot of takeaways there for us all to make sure that we think about it in a new light. And as you said, Lee, putting the right you've made the examples in our head, you know, so we get frustrated when we can use things we have to use by a keyboard if your mouse doesn't work, you know, and putting that lens on to create that empathy. So now that we understand those things, to think about other people and the frustrations that they may happen whenever they're trying to use the website. It's just not, it shouldn't be happening, but it's accessible.
Yeah.
It needs to be there to the fore. So thank you so much for doing that. And I think if there's no other questions there, we will close tonight's session. Thank you all for joining. Thank you for taking the time out. Please do keep an eye out on the on your emails from BCS members about upcoming events. We'll have a couple more, maybe one more before the end of the year, but we'll definitely have another program starting off in September after the holidays. So thank you for attending. Thank you for joining. Thank you, Lee, once again.
No, thank you for hosting it.
And we're delighted to have the opportunity. So we'll wish you all a very pleasant evening, and take care, stay well, stay safe, and look forward to seeing you all again. Thanks very much.
No problem. Take
Night
care.
now. Bye bye. Bye bye.